Welcome back to our mini-series on meditation and self-development. Last time we learned about the demons which can come from possible weaknesses in our own mind as a result of the defilements of greed, hatred and delusion which may be lurking there. We found out that these defilements can interfere with our decision-making process in some cases. And last time we also advocated having principles in our decision-making to help us to avoid succumbing to the power of these defilements in the mind. Well, this week it's not too late to start talking about what those principles actually consist of. And later on in the program we're going to look at a total of 10 different ways to help us make decisions in different situations. In fact, when you look at a situation, you can describe the situation as either positive, neutral or negative, as it concerns our ability to make progress in meditation. A positive situation would be the sort of thing which generates the richness of mind which will allow us to go further in our meditation. A neutral situation would be one which doesn't affect our meditation either positively or negatively. Maybe it's just a way of using up our time. A negative situation will be the result of a decision which will upset your ability to make progress in meditation at all. Maybe because of negative states of mind which will build up as a result of that particular action. So what we're going to be looking at in this program today is how to measure whether a decision in a situation will give rise to either a negative, neutral or a positive situation as a result of the decision which we might make. Because for any sort of action in the world, there are many ways in which you can describe the nature of that action. Some particular scenarios, we may have a feeling that it may be a good thing to do or a bad thing to do in that situation. But sometimes it's hard to put our finger on exactly why we consider it to be a positive or a negative decision in such a situation. Sometimes if you ask for the principles which people make their decisions on, you get as many answers as there are people. But what we'll try to look at today is a more structured way of decision making, a way by which you can actually plan ahead and have some certainty about the decisions you're making, so that the decisions you make can be ones which are going to supplement and enhance your ability to meditate well. Any situation can be looked at in many different ways. Let's take an example first of all of perhaps giving a meal of food to the late Mother Teresa of Calcutta, who of course we know is a very outstanding woman who has done a lot for society, especially in the poverty-stricken areas of India. Supposing you were to give Mother Teresa a plate of food. A very simple person might justify that, saying it's a positive thing to do, because we know that by eating a plate of food, then Mother Teresa at least will be saved from starvation for another day. It's a very simplistic way of looking at it, but that would be a way of measuring our decision in terms of thinking of the benefit to others. Another person might look at the same situation and say, giving a plate of food is a very positive thing. Why? Not for Mother Teresa's benefit, but for the benefit of all the people who she will help as a result of the strength she gets from the food. In this particular case, measuring the decision is in terms of the benefit that the plate of food will give to society as a whole. A third way of looking at the situation might be to look at not the benefits which the food will give, but in fact the intention behind the person giving the food in the first place. They can see that if the person can be able to let go of the food, perhaps the possible hunger or the temptation to eat it for themselves, then that person is being able to relinquish the power of greed or stinginess in their own mind, which does improve the quality of their mind. So this would be looking at the situation in terms of intention. Another person might look at the same situation and again come to a different conclusion, that if a person can afford to be generous, and if that person can have such a positive intention in their mind, then this will be a thing which in the future will lead that person to be given to by others, because it's said that a person who gives is loved by others. A person who gives will receive in return. So in this particular situation we're looking at the scenario in terms of doing an action which we will not regret at a later date. Last but not least, there may be the meditators amongst us who, giving such a plate of food to Mother Teresa, find that their own mind is illuminated more inside than it was before. This arising of illumination in the mind would say that in fact it's a positive situation. But the way that we measure the positive situation in this scenario is that it gives more illumination to the mind itself. So we can see now that even for the same situation, you can look at it in many different ways, and there may be possibly different principles which you can use in the same situation to decide whether it's a good or a bad decision you're making about it. It's rather like a medicine cabinet. Because there are many different diseases, then there are also many different medicines to treat the diseases. Some sorts of medicine, if you apply them to the wrong diseases, can give a very dangerous result. Try, for example, putting foot ointment in your eye. Although foot ointment is good in itself and it's good for treating bad toenails, but if you put it in your eye, it may make you blind. In the same way with decision making, if you use the wrong sort of decision making tool in the wrong situation, then it may give also an unreliable result. So it's best to be able to apply the right decision making principle to the right situation, and we'll try to talk about these as we go along, because there's a total of 10 different ways of making decisions which we have at our disposal. The first way I'd like to talk about is the intention behind the decision. Supposing we're making a decision and we find that the decision we make is based in terms of not being under the influence of the defilements in the mind. So that means that the decision we make is not based on greed, not based on hatred, and not based on delusion. Then the chances are that that decision will be a good decision. Sometimes our actions may not be clear. Sometimes it's only the intention behind the actions which is apparent to us. For example, if children sharing out a cake take a bigger helping for themselves than they give to their friends, although it's not bad or evil, their action, but it does show that they have greed in their minds. And this would tell us that in fact that those children are making a decision which is unfavorable to their meditation progress. So even the presence of greed, hatred, or delusion in our decision already tells us that it's a bad decision. However, decisions where there is no influence by greed, hatred, or delusion, then the chances are that these sort of decisions are in fact positive, or at the very least neutral decisions. A second way of deciding about a decision is looking at whether it illuminates or darkens our mind. For those of you who by now are regular meditators, will start to see illumination inside yourself, maybe not only when you're meditating, but also during the day with your eyes open, you still have an awareness of the illumination in your mind. If you find that you're about to make a decision and you find that the brightness in your mind starts to disappear, then the chances are that the decision you're about to take is an erroneous one. However, the sort of decisions which you might make which actually add to the illumination in your mind, well, these may be the sort of things you should be doing more often. The third sort of decision-making principle I'd like to talk about is in terms of the outcomes of the decision. You may regret an action at a later date, or you may be happy with an action at a later date. A later date here might mean an hour in the future, a week in the future, maybe tens of years in the future, who knows, maybe even the next lifetime. If you have some inkling that in the future you may regret a decision, then this is something which you should avoid at all costs. It helps us to realize that some of the work we do, some of the actions which we do which are difficult in the beginning, things like, for example, doing our revision for our examinations since early in the year, it may be hard work in the beginning, but in the end you will not regret that you have done that work. So this is a good principle to use for this sort of decision making where you are talking about the actions which may give their fruits at a later date, where there is some time lag between the work which we do and seeing the fruits of our labors. A fourth way of making decisions is to measure up our decisions in terms of what we call the 5 precepts. 5 precepts, if you can remember, are 5 actions which take advantages of the weaknesses in ourselves or in others. For example, we know very well that the things which people love the most in the world are their own lives, their possessions, their own spouse, and the love of the truth. We also know that our own mind can be very sensitive to the negative influence of intoxicants, which may cloud the mind or allow us not to use our conscience to the full. So this is why we have 5 precepts as a very clear and very concrete guideline to show that killing other people or animals, stealing, committing adultery, telling lies, or taking alcohol or other intoxicants like drugs or even cigarettes, these can be things which are going to interfere with our quality of mind for sure. So if you want a very clear rule of thumb, then measuring your own actions up to the 5 precepts is a very clear way of making a decision about whether an action in a particular situation is going to be positive or negative for you and other people. If it does conflict with the 5 precepts, then the chances are that it's certainly negative. However, if it does not conflict with the 5 precepts, then the chances are that it's at least neutral and possibly positive. But if you want to go beyond the 5 precepts, then there are another set of virtues which go with the 5 precepts, which go over and beyond, which are called the 5 virtues. And if you'd like to look at what these 5 virtues comprise, we find that any sort of action which fits in with either generosity, fits in with compassion, fits in with contentment with one's own spouse, fits in with truthfulness, and which fits in with mindfulness, then the chances are that that sort of decision, the decision to do those 5 categories of action, will in fact be very positive for us and our quality of mind. If we go a little further to look at the next way of looking at decisions, this is where we start to come more into the social sphere. With 5 precepts, we're already talking partially about the decisions which affect other people, but in this particular case, we ought to be looking at also situations which not only we don't regret, but also which others don't regret at a later date. This is something which, if we can appreciate the feelings of others, then we ought to be always taking into account whenever our actions affect other people's lives. Really, the sort of decisions which we should be looking for are decisions which, when put into action, will bring neither us nor others regret at a later date. If we are regretting it at a later date, even if the other people aren't, then we should still not do that thing. If the other people don't regret it but we do, then again that's not worth doing. And if both of us regret it, then certainly we should stay away from that sort of action. Apart from regrets, another way of looking at actions in the social context is to look at the benefit which comes from the action. Often we hear in modern management terminology about a win-win situation. This is talking about the benefits which come from the outcome of the decisions which we make. If both of us win, that is, we win and they win as a result of a situation which we have decided, then that is worth doing. However, if only we win and they don't, or they win and we don't, or neither of us win, then these are the sort of actions which we ought to be avoiding if at all possible. In a wider social context, sometimes we have factors coming into our decision making which we haven't talked about so far. If you talk about actions which may on a personal level seem beneficial, but on a social level are not beneficial, then sometimes if it's in the social sphere we have to give up our selfish interest in order for the greater and wider social benefit. This can take place, for example, when we have to neglect maybe the interests of ourselves or our families in order to do something positive for the wider society. Supposing our society is affected by the plague and the government calls upon volunteers to help out with treating the other people in society so that the plague doesn't spread to us and our family, then we'd be better off to put our time in to help society as a whole rather than locking ourselves up in our house and ignoring the situation. This would be a case in which using our altruism to help society as a whole may be the better thing to do in case that the social situation is a bad one. So sometimes we have to take the social situation into account as well. So far we've talked about 7 different ways of making decisions. In fact, there are more than this, but I'm only going to mention them as headings in passing today. The other decisions which we're talking about are possibly the spiritual decisions in life, which we're going to be talking about in 2 weeks' time with what we call the mention of the Noble Eightfold Path. There are also the factor of not contradicting precepts, virtue, custom, or the law, which can take place in certain situations where it's not clear to us what is right in a social situation. And last but not least, we have the 38 blessings, which is a very long and complex topic, which I don't have time to go into today, but maybe at a later date. which is a very interactive way of looking at whether a decision is positive or not in a situation. Last but not least, some people sometimes ask why we cannot just use the law as a way to decide whether a decision made by a person is positive or negative. Well, as we've already mentioned, even intention can sometimes upset our ability to meditate. Even the things we say can sometimes upset our ability to meditate. Usually the law only steps in when it comes to actions which we do against others which has evidence. And sometimes even the law can make mistakes. If we don't have a witness, then it's very hard to prosecute. But what we're talking about in terms of our meditation practice is often actions which are very private, actions which no one else sees us doing, but which can affect the quality of our own mind. So this is why we cannot rely merely upon the law as the guideline which we need when we are making decisions. So today we have run very, very quickly through a total of 10 different guidelines which we can use for making decisions about what is either negative, neutral or positive in the way it may affect our ability to meditate. Maybe during this week you might like to observe yourself when you are making decisions to see what sort of principles you are using when you come to make decisions about what you're going to do in your life. You may find that your principles are not as clear as you originally thought, in which case you might try using some of the principles we've been talking about today. Next week we're going to be going on to look at the way in which we treat other people, especially relating to the things that we say to other people, to see how these can affect also our potential to be able to make progress in our meditation. So in the meantime, keep up with your meditation and try to be observant about yourself in the week to come, and I'll be seeing you again at the same time next week.